Representative Ilhan Omar just called Senator JD Vance a poverty tourist on live television, executing the strike inside a congressional hearing room she had meticulously organized down to the seating chart, presiding over a politically volatile subject she had handpicked in a sprawling institutional space she fully and completely believed she owned, leaning into her silver neck microphone with the distinct, polished, and overwhelming confidence of a woman who had rehearsed the devastating line in front of a mirror countless times and savored the sharp, acidic ring of it, she delivered her highly anticipated blow. She accused the junior senator from Ohio of cynically writing a best-selling book about growing up impoverished, eagerly selling the lucrative movie rights to Hollywood executives, subsequently marrying into generational American wealth, and then having the sheer audacity to sit in the United States Senate and lecture marginalized refugees about the mechanics of the American dream. All of this, she noted with a voice dripping in calibrated disdain, from a sprawling residence that boasted more bathrooms than her family's entire refugee camp had possessed shelters. If there is any us Purum who understands how money corrupts a person's memory of where they came from, it is the gentleman to my left, she declared, her posture radiating the aggressive triumph of a prosecutor closing an airtight case. She paused a masterful, intensely calibrated suspension of time, deliberately engineered to be neither too brief nor too drawn out, but rather the exact, pristine length of silence that cable news producers desperately require to cut a clean, viral, endlessly loopable clip. Poverty tourist, she repeated, letting the two words hang in the heavy air of the chamber. That's what we're working with. The gallery shifted in response, emitting not outright raucous applause, but rather something warmer, looser, and infinitely more dangerous to the target. The collective, relieved exhale of an audience that has just been officially granted permission by a figure of authority to openly laugh at a powerful, opposing man. Three leather-backed chairs behind her, Jamal, her seasoned legislative director, allowed himself a single, highly satisfied nod, the unmistakable, quiet gesture of a Washington strategist who had personally helped craft the lethal line and was genuinely thrilled with its flawless execution on the grandest stage. Up in the cramped, brightly lit press section overlooking the desk, a correspondent for the Huffington Post was already frantically hammering away on their keyboard, drafting the tweet that would soon ignite the internet. Omar eviscerates Vance on poverty credentials in fiery hearing exchange. By absolutely every metric that dictates political success and narrative dominance in modern Washington, immediate virality, instant quotability, and primetime cable news replayability, it was an absolute, flawless, unassailable moment of triumph. It was also, decisively and irreversibly, the very last moment Ilhan Omar would control anything that transpired in that room, because the man she had just publicly branded a poverty tourist was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed entirely on a closed, gray, utterly unremarkable laptop resting on the mahogany desk. It was the kind of basic utilitarian machine a normal person picks up at a local Best Buy on a random Tuesday afternoon because their old one unexpectedly gave out, and his right hand rested gently, almost reverently, on its cold lid, in the exact manner a hand rests upon a Bible just before delivering sworn testimony. He was not gripping the edges, he was not fidgeting with the hinge or tapping his fingers. His hand rested with the profound, unsettling stillness of a man who has carried a staggeringly heavy burden across a vast, unforgiving distance and has finally, after years of walking, located the exact perfect spot to set it down. 7 agonizing, uninterrupted seconds of pure silence ticked by. Omar instinctively reached for her condensation-covered water glass, a sudden, jerky movement born not out of actual physical thirst, but because 7 seconds of dead air following a political punchline meticulously designed to end a man's career, is the kind of suffocating, deafening silence that desperately begs to be filled with any available physical gesture before the entire room begins to collectively wonder why the laughter has suddenly died. Vance flatly refused to fill that silence. He let it bleed out on its own, exhibiting the terrifying patience of a man raised in a chaotic, violence-filled, deafeningly noisy house who learned very early in his traumatic childhood that you must simply wait out the noise, outlast the shouting, and let the chaos exhaust itself before ever attempting to speak. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was remarkably quiet. It was not soft. Softness implies weakness or retreat, but quiet, embodying the crucial, undeniable difference between a man who forcefully lowers his volume out of fear and a man who deliberately lowers his volume because he possesses the absolute certainty that the entire room will instinctively lean forward, straining their necks, just to catch every single syllable he is about to drop. The Congresswoman is right about one thing, Vance began, his Appalachian cadence cutting through the sterile, conditioned air of the hearing room. I did grow up poor, not refugee camp, poor. I won't make that comparison, and I mean that. Her journey and mine are not the same. He paused, locking in the room's total, undivided attention, securing the emotional high ground without raising his tone a fraction of a decibel. But I will say this. Where I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, in a house where the medicine cabinet had more pills than the refrigerator had food, you learn one thing before you learn anything else. He slowly placed both of his large hands firmly on the still closed laptop lid, centering himself. You learn how to count, because when you don't have enough, you count everything, every dollar, every pill, every promise someone makes you and doesn't keep. With methodical, unhurried precision, Vance flipped open the laptop screen. If the mechanical hinge made any physical sound whatsoever, it was entirely swallowed and erased by the sudden, frantic, mechanical chorus of 14 high-definition television cameras simultaneously adjusting their optical focus, a collective, urgent whirring that sounded exactly like a swarm of heavy insects abruptly turning toward a blinding new light source. The Congresswoman called this hearing to talk about foreign influence in American campaign finance. I think that's a good idea. I think we should follow the money. So let's follow it, he stated flatly, stripping all emotion from his delivery. He looked directly at the center of his illuminated screen and read aloud a single, unadorned, massive number, dropping it into the room like an anvil, $2,800,000. He allowed the staggering multi-million-dollar figure to exist in the tense atmosphere without any immediate context, letting it hang suspended in the air in the exact, deliberate way a seasoned oncologist lets a grim, fatal test result sit on the sterile examination table between himself and the patient before ever attempting to explain what the terminal prognosis actually means. That is the total amount the Congresswoman's campaign paid to E Street Group, a political consulting firm owned and operated by Tim Minette, he explained, his voice utterly devoid of rhetorical flourish. He paused, letting the specific name settle into the congressional record. Tim Minette, who is now the Congresswoman's husband. Vance slowly looked up from the glowing screen, completely ignoring Omar to his right, bypassing the grandstanding committee members arranged on the dais, and turning his eyes directly, piercingly, into the glowing red light of the primary broadcast camera. He was no longer speaking to the room. He was bypassing the Capitol entirely, projecting his voice directly into the crowded kitchens, the sterile break rooms, the anxiety-filled hospital waiting rooms, and the exhausted night shift nursing stations across the country where ordinary working-class Americans were watching this spectacle unfold. I want to translate that number because numbers don't mean anything until you translate them into someone's life. He said, shifting the paradigm of the entire hearing. His eyes briefly flicked to a handwritten note physically taped to the plastic edge of his machine, hastily penned in blue ink on a jagged scrap of paper, the specific kind of frantic, vital note a person writes down because the core thought mattered far too much to trust to a digital keyboard. In the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, the exact neighborhood the Congresswoman represents, the exact neighborhood where the Somali community that carried her into federal office lives and works and prays, there's a woman named Faduma Hassan. Vance continued, weaving a devastatingly specific human narrative into the cold financial data. I'll have more to say about her later. What matters now is one number. Faduma makes $29,000 a year as a certified nursing assistant at Hennepin Healthcare. Vance briefly closed his eyes, an action taken not for cheap theatrical drama, but with the quiet, genuine strain of a man running grim depression. $2.8 million divided by $29,000 is 96 years. 96 years of Fadumo's manual labor paid directly to one company, owned exclusively by one man, who ultimately married the political candidate. He delivered the math, acting as an unassailable indictment. He turned his attention back to the laptop screen, ready to dig deeper into the digital files. So let's count. This highly publicized joint subcommittee hearing on foreign influence in American campaign finance had been Ilhan Omar's passionate pet project from its very inception. She had aggressively and skillfully steered the concept through 3 contentious preliminary caucus meetings, forced it through 2 procedural floor motions, and leveraged a long series of political debts and phone calls to ranking members who owed her crucial media hits from the previous vicious election cycle. The hearing was fundamentally designed as a grand theatrical showcase, a prime-time, C-SPAN carried, heavily social media optimized, flawlessly lit platform specifically built for the Congresswoman who had successfully made the eradication of foreign dark money in American politics the central, unyielding pillar of her public political identity. The target list her office had assembled was highly specific and politically lucrative. AIPAC, the sprawling Saudi Arabian lobbying apparatus, and various conservative super PACs hiding behind opaque, untraceable donor structures. Her dedicated staff had painstakingly assembled a massive 40-page, professionally printed, meticulously tabbed, intricately color-coded dossier organized by country of origin, a grueling research project that had consumed 6 weeks of legislative resources. The strategic game plan for the morning was brutally simple and universally understood by her team. Aggressively name the foreign countries, name the shadowy PACs, read the massive dollar amounts into the microphone, and let the network cameras do the rest of the political execution. And for the first 12 exhilarating minutes of the broadcast, the strategy worked with flawless, breathtaking efficiency. Omar delivered a soaring, emotionally resonant opening statement entirely from memory, utilizing absolutely no notes and relying on no teleprompter to guide her. She spoke poignantly and powerfully about her traumatic childhood in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, the largest, most desperate refugee camp in the world, where 200,000 displaced souls lived out their days trapped under structures made of nothing more than flimsy, plastic sheeting and desperate prayer. She spoke movingly about the exact day her family finally arrived in Arlington, Virginia, and the profound awe of seeing a building taller than 3 stories for the very first time in her life. She spoke eloquently about what it genuinely means to come from a broken country where corrupt foreign governments arbitrarily decided absolutely everything who got to eat, who was allowed to work, who was permitted to live and to arrive in a democratic country where foreign governments were supposedly designed to decide absolutely nothing. And yet, she said, expertly dropping her voice into the deliberate, resonant, vibrating register that her elite communications team specifically referred to as the landing gear, a lower, slower, hypnotic frequency purposely designed to make scrolling constituents instantly stop and listen. And yet, We sit in this chamber in the greatest democracy in the history of the world, and we allow foreign money to flow into our elections like water through a broken pipe, and we call it lobbying. We call it consulting. We call it diplomacy. I call it what it is, corruption with a passport. The gallery responded with rapt attention. C-SPAN viewership metrics surged rapidly past 1.4 million live viewers. And on the platform X, 3 separate, highly edited clips from her opening monologue were already circulating wildly. Each clip featured a different fiery pull, quote, and each was accumulating algorithmic engagement at the exact terrifying velocity that unmistakably indicates a mere political news moment is rapidly crossing over into a major cultural event. Then, high on the adrenaline of the moment, she turned her sights to JD Vance, and she made her fatal unscripted error. The highly personal insult was absolutely not in the prepared, vetted remarks. Jamal, her fiercely protective legislative director, who had meticulously reviewed every single draft of the opening statement and had specifically urgently advised against launching personal attacks on any scheduled witness, telling her twice in the final prep meeting to simply let the dossier do the work, would later tell a traumatized colleague that he literally saw disaster happening in slow motion before it actually happened. He saw the physical shift in her shoulders, recognized the subtle, arrogant way her chin lifted, and tracked the almost imperceptible predatory movement of her eyes, darting from the red light of the camera down to the witness table. I knew, he later said. I've worked for her long enough to know when she's about to leave the script, and I couldn't stop it. Nobody can stop it. It's the exact thing that made her, and it's the exact thing that will. He didn't even need to finish the grim sentence. What happened next was permanently recorded on 14 high-definition cameras. The infamous poverty tourist line, the gallery's mocking laughter, the viral tweet from the Huffington Post correspondent that would rapidly reach 200,000 impressions within a mere 20 minutes before being frantically deleted by midnight when the narrative collapsed. But what the cameras also recorded, and what absolutely no one in the distracted press section noticed at the precise time of the infraction, was this critical micro-movement when Omar delivered the devastating insult. Vance's hand did not fly to his microphone in defense, nor did it move to his face in embarrassment. Instead, his hand moved directly to the handwritten note taped to the edge of his laptop, the specific note bearing Fadumo Hassan's meager salary. He touched it once, lightly, with his index finger, executing the quiet, grounding gesture of a man reminding his own soul exactly why he had walked into this room. He did not respond to the flashy insult. Not then, not ever. In the excruciating 46 minutes that systematically followed, he would absolutely not mention it, reference it, allude to it, or even acknowledge that the attack had ever occurred. It would hang suspended in the tense room like a grotesque, highly inappropriate photograph pinned to a wall that everyone in the room can clearly see, yet no one possesses the courage to take down present, entirely visible, and completely, aggressively ignored by the singular person who actually possessed the moral right to remove it. Before we talk about where the money went, Vance said, his tone shifting into a chilling, procedural gear, I want to make sure we're looking at the same map. He slowly turned the laptop slightly, not toward Omar in a gesture of combat, but respectfully toward the committee chair. It was a calculated gesture of institutional respect that the uninitiated cameras naturally read as mere deference, but that any seasoned political operative who had ever watched Vance surgically operate in Senate hearings recognized immediately as something else entirely: lethal, offensive positioning. A man who politely angles a digital screen toward the chair is a man who is actively preparing to permanently enter something highly damaging into the official congressional record. The Congresswoman has served in Congress since January 2019, 6 years. In that time, She has introduced or co-sponsored several pieces of legislation related to refugee resettlement, immigration reform, and foreign policy. I want to give her credit for the ones that matter, he stated, his voice devoid of sarcasm. He scrolled down his screen and read 3 specific bill titles aloud into the record. The Refugee Resettlement Accountability Act, the No Ban Act, and the FAIR Act, the Fighting for Asylum Seekers and Refugees Equity Act. He looked up at Omar, and there was absolutely nothing hostile in his facial expression. If anything, it was the deeply unsettling expression of a man who was about to say something brutal that he genuinely wished he didn't have to say. How many of those became law? He asked the question hanging like a guillotine blade. Omar instantly leaned forward, her defensive instincts flaring. Senator, legislation is not the only measure of, she began trying to muddy the waters. Vance cut through the political noise effortlessly without raising his voice. I know, but it is a measure, and the answer is 0. The word 0 sank and settled into the room in the exact way a heavy stone sits immovably at the bottom of a perfectly clear pond, visible from absolutely every conceivable angle and physically impossible to move or explain away. Vance meticulously dismantled the optics of her career, pointing out that none of those highly publicized bills had ever even received a basic floor vote. The Refugee Resettlement Accountability Act, the specific legislation the Congresswoman had loudly announced at a heavily attended press conference in Cedar Riverside, flanked by the Somali community, surrounded by cameras, utilizing vulnerable children, holding political signs that her own staff had freshly printed that very morning. That specific bill never even received a preliminary committee hearing. Not because scheming Republicans had blocked it. I checked, Vance noted dryly. No opposing motion was ever filed. It died because it was never moved. The press conference happened. The legislation didn't. He paused, and something deep within the timbre of his voice shifted. It did not become harder, but it became vastly more personal, as though the very next sentence was one he had pondered in the dark for a very long time before finally deciding it was necessary to say. Where I grew up, there were a lot of people who made grand promises to my mother. Social workers, boyfriends, politicians who came to the neighborhood every 2 years with a clipboard and a bright smile. They all promised things, and then they left. And my mother, who was not stupid, she was an addict, but she was absolutely not stupid. My mother eventually learned to measure people not by what they verbally promised, but by what they physically carried out the door. He looked directly into the camera lens, bypassing the politicians entirely. I want to measure the Congresswoman by what she carried out the door. Omar's voice cracked back across the room, sharp, quick, and laced with panic. Senator, I find it deeply troubling that you would use your personal trauma as a rhetorical device in a hearing about foreign. Vance's voice did not rise a single pitch to meet her outrage. You opened this hearing with your childhood in a refugee camp. I'm opening my testimony with my childhood in a trailer park. If your biography is relevant, so is mine. The massive hearing room instantly plunged into an absolute, suffocating quiet. It was not the quiet of shock, but rather the heavy, undeniable quiet of profound recognition, the specific, terrifying silence that forms when a large room full of powerful people simultaneously realizes that the fundamental rules of engagement have just been irreversibly changed. Omar's aggressive counterattack had been legitimate within the old rules, but it had also just been flawlessly neutralized in exactly 2 sentences, not by defensively attacking it, but by ruthlessly holding it up to a mirror. She had attempted to use her biography as an impenetrable shield. He had used his as a devastating leveler. They were now standing on the exact same brutal ground, and she had been the one to put them there. Behind Omar, Jamal nervously unlocked his phone, stared at the blank screen, and frantically locked it again. The digital screen had shown absolutely nothing. No incoming notifications, no emergency messages, no media alerts, but he had checked it anyway, executing the desperate, involuntary reflex of a political operative whose survival instincts are suddenly running miles ahead of his logical ability to explain exactly why he is terrified. I want to tell you about Fadumo Hassan. Vance continued, completely abandoning the laptop screen and locking his eyes permanently onto the C-SPAN camera, staring directly into the red light that connected this marble room to 1.9 million living rooms, where people were watching this unfold with the morbid fascination of people watching a dark weather system approaching on a flat, inescapable horizon, unable to look away, and entirely unable to do anything to stop it. Fadumo, he explained, came to this country in 2001 at the age of 19, having survived 7 brutal years in the exact same Dadaab refugee camp the Congresswoman had utilized in her opening monologue, arriving in Minneapolis in January, having never seen snow, believing the very sky was coming apart. He paused, lightly touching the handwritten note again, without reading from it. Fadumo was 44 now, a mother of 3, Amina, 19, aiming to be a physician's assistant, Youssef, 15, and Keda, 11. She worked grueling, bone-deep, 1-2 hour shifts 5 days a week as a certified nursing assistant at Hennepin Healthcare. She changed soiled bedpans, meticulously checked blood pressure, and physically turned heavy patients who could no longer turn themselves, all for a meager $29,000 a year. The room was beyond quiet now. It was not just hearing room quiet. It was prayer quiet, the deeply unsettling, absolute silence that occurs when a room packed full of professional politicians trained entirely to perform suddenly stops performing and is forced to actually listen. Fadumo became a proud citizen in 2009, actively voting in every single election since. She voted for Omar in 2018, again in 2020, and a third time in 2022. Vance slowly looked down at his own hands. She also donated $50 in 2018, $35 in 2020, from a woman who makes $29,000 a year. That $85 is not a casual gesture. It's a fundamental decision. It's the desperate decision between new shoes for Amina's school year and forcing one more semester in the old ones. It was the profound decision a person makes when they truly, desperately believe that someone will finally carry their ignored voice into the powerful rooms where voices actually matter. He looked dead into the camera. Fadumo's $85 went directly into the exact same campaign account that subsequently paid $2.8 million to E Street Group, to the consulting firm exclusively owned by the Congresswoman's husband. He let the catastrophic juxtaposition detonate in the silence. I want to hold those two staggering numbers next to each other for a moment. $85 from a nursing assistant who genuinely believes, and $2.8 million funneled to a company owned by the man who shares the candidate's bed. In any other context, in any other industry, we would know exactly what to call that. We would not need a congressional hearing. Up in the gallery, in the third row, the older Somali woman in the blue hijab, who had remained perfectly still since the gavel fell, slowly closed her eyes, not in immediate sorrow, but in an exhaustion far older than sorrow. It was the heartbreaking expression of someone who had spent an entire lifetime helplessly watching powerful people use her vulnerable community as a colorful backdrop for political photographs, and who had just miraculously heard a Republican senator she did not vote for perfectly articulate the exact painful shape of what that betrayal actually feels like. At the witness table, Omar's right hand rested flat on the wood, but her index finger was tapping not rhythmically, not even consciously, but executing the frantic, involuntary percussion of a collapsing nervous system desperately trying to process lethal information, vastly faster than the conscious mind could organize a coherent defense. Vance turned back to the laptop, and the underlying architecture of his voice hardened. The Appalachian warmth remained, but a rigid prosecutorial structure emerged beneath it, like steel scaffolding suddenly becoming visible through a dense, dissipating fog. He was no longer telling a poignant story. He was aggressively, systematically building a criminal case, relying strictly on public FEC filings, official court records, and published investigative journalism. He meticulously laid out the devastating timeline. Tim Minette began working as a highly paid fundraising consultant for the campaign in 2018. Their illicit personal relationship ignited, and Minette's then-wife filed for divorce in August 2019, explicitly stating in brutal court filings that her husband was leaving the marriage because he was actively carrying on an affair with a sitting member of Congress. Omar subsequently filed for her own divorce, and the two married in March 2020. Throughout this entire scandalous, highly publicized period, the campaign's massive payments to E Street Group did not stop. They did not slow down. They violently, inexplicably accelerated. Vance read the staggering figures year by year. $523,000 in 2019, $614,000 in 2020, a cumulative total reaching $2.8 million for vague, undefined services like fundraising, consulting, and digital advertising. I spent 18 months on the Senate Finance Committee. I've read a lot of complex consulting contracts. A consulting firm that receives $2.8 million typically has a physical office, actual employees, a diverse client list, tangible deliverables. E Street Group has exactly one employee, Tim Minette, and exactly one client, his wife. He let the damning sentence breathe, refusing to emotionally underline it, and simply moved on. He detailed a highly embarrassing $2,800 fine levied by the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board for blatant misuse of campaign funds for personal travel prior to their marriage, glancing at his handwritten note to point out that the fine itself was literally less than what Fadumo Hassan paid in federal income taxes the previous year. He highlighted glaring, potentially criminal contradictions between their legal marriage certificates and joint tax returns, noting chillingly that paperwork doesn't lie on its own. It doesn't have the imagination. Desperate, Omar leaned into her microphone, the immense effort to keep her voice level painfully visible to the entire room. Senator, you voted against the Afghan Refugee Resettlement Support Act. You voted to cut refugee admissions by 50%. You have spent your career opposing every piece of legislation that would protect the communities you now claim to care about, she shouted. That's fair, Vance agreed immediately. The two simple words stopped her completely, not because they were aggressive, but because they were the exact, disarming opposite. Vance nodded, actually nodded, in agreement. I did vote against that package. And I'll tell you why. I read it, all 600 pages. And I found $14 million allocated to consulting contracts with absolutely no competitive bidding process, no named vendors, no deliverables, just consulting. I don't vote for bills that spend refugee money on unnamed consultants. He seamlessly, effortlessly turned her best rhetorical punch into his next devastating sentence. Omar was a boxer who had landed a clean right hand, only to watch in horror as her opponent used the momentum of the blow to step closer for the kill. Under the desk, Jamal was frantically typing to Omar's legal counsel, staring at the three dots of an incoming reply that appeared, disappeared, and then vanished entirely. Vance then dragged the hearing completely into the abyss, shifting from public FEC data into a deeper, much darker floor of financial investigation. He produced a physical document, not a clean printout, but a crooked, slightly off-center photocopy, the exact kind of messy document produced by a neglected machine in a dusty county clerk's office, its very imperfection serving as its own undeniable proof of authenticity. The documents reveal that between 2019 and 2023, E Street Group had secretly subcontracted an astonishing $340,000 to a completely unknown entity called Riverside Community Strategies, LLC, supposedly for community outreach in Omar's district. The firm was registered in Wyoming, the premier state for establishing untraceable LLCs to hide ownership with no website, no actual office, operating out of a commercial mailbox in Cheyenne, and managed by a registered agent directly tied to Minette's past. Vance looked directly at the camera. $340,000 for community outreach in Cedar Riverside, he whispered, letting the magnitude of the fraud settle. He revealed he had personally asked Fedumo, along with 17 other entrenched community leaders, imams, and grocery owners in Cedar Riverside, if they had ever seen or heard of this supposed outreach firm. Not a single one had. Vance aligned the edges of his documents with the quiet, precise gesture of a man who once counted pills to ensure his mother hadn't overdosed and who had never, ever been careless with inventory since. He then produced an internal E Street Group email from Minette to a bookkeeper, explicitly instructing them to split the invoice to keep payments under the $200,000 threshold that would automatically trigger an FEC review. Then came the absolute kill shot, an internal email from Omar's travel scheduler ordering a 4-night luxury couples vacation at the Grace Bay Club in Turks and Caicos, costing $3,200 a night to be illegally disguised on federal FEC filings as a donor engagement retreat, using only the street address to hide the resort's name. Vance calculated the horrific math aloud in the dead silence of the room. That single illicit $12,800 vacation cost exactly 5 months of Fedumo Hassan's grueling take-home pay. Omar panicked, her voice tight, fast, and desperate, baselessly accusing Vance of fabricating the documents in a coordinated smear campaign. Vance didn't even look up from the damning page. He simply gestured to the table in front of her, the table holding her useless, unopened 40-page dossier on AIPAC, and calmly invited the Congresswoman to produce the original booking confirmations and original E Street Group invoices under oath, right then and there. He gave her exactly 12 seconds of agonizing, unbroken silence. Vance counted them in his head, having learned long ago that silence, much like money, reveals far more about a person than anything they choose to say. Omar produced absolutely nothing. She placed her hand flat on the table, pressed down hard, and stared blankly at a distant point on the far wall, paralyzed between the triumphant hearing she had planned and the absolute political slaughter that had just occurred. Watching the destruction from behind, Jamal stopped typing, pocketed his dark phone, and stood up, walking toward the side exit with the measured, terrifying pace of a man who has survived enough political disasters to know you never run in public, slipping out the door to frantically call for a crisis meeting. Vance lowered his laptop screen until it was nearly closed, the deliberate gesture of a surgeon putting away his instruments. He mapped out the ultimate cynical mechanism of her career. Every time Omar generated national outrage with controversial statements, her fundraising skyrocketed, the consulting fees increased, and the money flowed directly into her husband's untraceable Wyoming shell companies. The voiceless didn't get louder. Congresswoman Vance stated with grave, terminal finality, "Your bank account did." He quoted Fedumo directly, honoring the exact careful cadence of a woman speaking her third language. "I gave my money to someone who said she would carry our voice, but I never heard my voice. I only heard hers." With the hearing room dead silent, Vance pushed the laptop aside and delivered the ultimate checkmate. He produced one final solitary page, holding it not for the cameras, but close to his chest, like a letter read many times. He laid bare a disturbing pattern. Between 2020 and 2024, the Congresswoman took 4 highly suspicious trips to countries with active U.S. lobbying interests funded by a murky combination of campaign funds, congressional allowances, and undisclosed third-party organizations. He didn't even need to name the specific countries. The devastating implication had already sucked all remaining oxygen from the room, confirming whispered hallway rumors across Washington. I am not accusing the Congresswoman of being a foreign agent. I want to be very clear about that, Vance stated, locking eyes with her directly for the very first time in 7 minutes. I am accusing her of a pattern, a campaign finance structure pact to consulting firm, to LLC, to subcontractor that is specifically designed to make money impossible to follow. The accusation turned in the lock of her career with lethal, quiet precision. Omar desperately turned to her left, not to her communications director, but to her attorney, a woman in a gray suit who charged by the hour and knew exactly when to stay utterly silent. Omar opened her mouth to speak to the lawyer, started a frantic syllable, and then suddenly stopped, her eyes darting to the 14 cameras transmitting her panic to 2.1 million viewers. She swallowed the word. In front of the entire political world, the woman who had built an entire political empire on her fearless public voice reached for a lawyer instead of her microphone. That single aborted half syllable was the loudest, most devastating sound of her career, the undeniable sound of someone who finally does not know what to say. Jamal, now isolated in the marble hallway outside, dialed a crisis operative, demanding a meeting tonight because he had just watched his boss look for a lawyer on live television. Vance rested his hand on the stack of documents, nodded to the committee chair, and respectfully suggested the investigation begin with the papers on his table. The chairman looked at the empty chair where Jamal had sat, looked at the damning evidence, and softly tapped the gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The room emptied with the shell-shocked, hushed lethargy of a disaster zone. Omar stood up, leaving her meticulously tabbed, untouched 0-page dossier sitting on the table like a tragic monument to her hubris, and retreated with her lawyer through a back service hallway to avoid the press. She ignored desperate shouts from a Politico reporter, walking with the frozen, level-headed pace of a woman desperately trying not to show fatal damage. The heavy marble door shut behind her with a definitive thud. Vance quietly packed his 6 pages into a manila envelope, zipped his bag, and took a sip of water, a workman calmly finishing a brutal shift while the entire room watched in stunned silence. Within a mere 24 hours, the institutional avalanche officially began. The Office of Congressional Ethics announced a preliminary review, and the FEC slapped E Street Group with a brutal, expansive records request demanding every single invoice over $10,000. Tim Minette immediately lawyered up and vanished from public view, completely abandoning Omar to attend a scheduled Brooklyn fundraiser entirely alone, a deafening, highly visible absence that high-dollar donors immediately clocked and understood. Her office issued a pathetic 3-sentence deflection, baselessly citing a racist Islamophobic attack, notably failing to produce a single counter-document or address a single piece of Vance's devastating arithmetic. The political fallout in her home district was catastrophic, a devastating, permanent 1-4 point plunge in approval among her core Somali American base in Cedar Riverside. The Wall Street Journal quickly dropped a 3,200-word front-page investigative nuke fully corroborating the ghost firm, and Omar began frantically canceling all scheduled television appearances, citing identical, copy-pasted scheduling conflicts. On Fox News, Vance twisted the knife with a cold, polite smile, telling the host He only hoped Fadumo gets her $85 back. Deep inside the Cedar Riverside Towers, Fadumo Hassan sat quietly at her kitchen table, her phone laid face down to ignore frantic texts from her sister, her television completely dark. Across the table, her daughter Amina, driven by the promise of a future far beyond $29,000 a year bedpan shifts, navigated a community college portal, researching biology and anatomy prerequisites. Fadumo looked at her own weathered hands, the exact same hands that had surrendered a precious $50 to a politician who promised salvation but delivered only silence and betrayal. Amina clicked enroll for her morning biology class, and a small, vibrant green checkmark bloomed on the screen, signaling the quiet, genuine beginning of an American dream built on actual labor, not political grift. But as that green checkmark sealed Amina's hopeful future in the quiet apartment, a far more terrifying judgment was rapidly accelerating in Washington. The FEC deadlines were rapidly ticking down, federal subpoenas were quietly being drafted in unlit offices, and the explosive evidence neatly packed in Vance's manila envelope had ignited a federal firestorm that no press release could ever extinguish. With the legal walls violently closing in and her dark money labyrinth fully exposed to the light, what exactly would the federal investigators find when they finally forced open the hidden books of the E Street Group?